Some people are born with steel in their spine and fire in their heart. Others discover these qualities when the world tries to crush them beneath its weight. Sarah Martinez was about to find out which kind of person she really was. The morning Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison first laid eyes on the new recruit, he knew she was different. Not because she was one of the few women attempting to join the most elite military unit in the world, but because of the way she held herself when everyone else was trying to tear her down. While drill instructors screamed in her face and fellow recruits whispered behind her back, Sarah stood like a mountain in a storm, unmoved, unbroken, and absolutely determined. What Jake didn't know was that Sarah had already survived something far worse than anything the military could throw at her. She had escaped a nightmare that would have destroyed most people, and now she was running toward the very thing that others ran from, the chance to prove that some spirits cannot be broken, no matter how hard the world tries. This is the true story of a woman who refused to be a victim, a SEAL leader who saw potential where others saw weakness, and a journey that would test the limits of human endurance. It's about discovering that sometimes the people who seem the most fragile are actually the strongest of all. The question wasn't whether they could break her. The question was whether she would break the system that tried to stop her. Sarah Martinez learned to disappear long before she learned to fight back. In the small Texas town where she grew up, disappearing was a survival skill that kept her alive through 16 years of hell disguised as a normal childhood. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a respected mechanic who fixed cars during the day and broke his family at night. To the outside world, he was a hard-working man who kept his lawn perfectly trimmed and always had a smile for the neighbors. Behind the closed doors of their modest ranch house, he was something else entirely. The beating started when Sarah was 7 years old. At first, they were reserved for her mother, Rosa, who worked double shifts at the local diner to keep food on the table. Sarah would hide in her closet, pressing her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sounds of violence echoing through the thin walls. But children can't stay invisible forever. The first time Miguel turned his rage on Sarah, she was defending her younger brother, Carlos. The boy had broken one of Miguel's beer bottles while playing in the garage, and their father's face had transformed into something terrifying. Sarah stepped between them without thinking, her 8-year-old body trembling but determined. The backhand across her face sent her flying into the wall, leaving a dent in the drywall that Miguel made her stare at every day afterward, as a reminder. "You want to be the hero?" he had whispered that night, his breath reeking of alcohol as he grabbed her chin. "Heroes get hurt, mija. Remember that." But Sarah didn't learn to cower. Instead, she learned to strategize. She discovered that if she drew Miguel's attention to herself, he left Carlos and their mother alone. She became an expert at reading his moods, knowing exactly when to speak up and when to stay silent. She learned to take the hits in places that wouldn't show, to move quickly enough to avoid the worst of his anger, and to never, ever cry where he could see her tears. School became her refuge, but even there, Sarah had to be careful. Teachers noticed the occasional bruise, the way she flinched when adults moved too quickly, the fact that she never brought friends home. Mrs. Henderson, her 4th grade teacher, had pulled her aside once to ask if everything was okay at home. Sarah had looked up at the kind woman with her too serious eyes and said, "Everything is fine. Thank you for asking." She was 9 years old when she perfected the art of lying to protect the people she loved. As Sarah grew older, she found other ways to cope. She excelled in her studies, pouring herself into books that transported her to different worlds where heroes actually won and good triumphed over evil. She joined the track team in middle school, discovering that running gave her a sense of control she had nowhere else. When she ran, she could push her body to its limits on her own terms. Her coach, Mr. Williams, noticed her dedication immediately. Sarah was always first to practice and last to leave. She ran like she was being chased, he often thought, not knowing how close to the truth he was. During one particularly brutal training session, he watched her push through obvious pain, her face set in determination that seemed far too mature for a 13-year-old. "Martinez," he called out as the other girls headed to the showers. "You can ease up, you know. This is practice, not the Olympics." Sarah stopped running and turned to face him, her chest heaving but her voice steady. "Respectfully, coach, easy is not an option for me."
Mr.
Williams studied her for a long moment, recognizing something in her eyes that reminded him of soldiers he had known during his time in the army. "Why is that, Sarah?"
"Because when you need to be strong, you can't just turn it on like a switch.
You have to build it every day." That conversation stayed with him for years. He made sure Sarah had every opportunity to excel, even driving her to meets when her parents couldn't make it, which was most of the time. Rosa was usually working, and Miguel claimed he was too busy. though Sarah suspected he just didn't want to watch her succeed at anything. High school brought new challenges and new opportunities. Sarah had grown into a striking young woman, tall and lean from years of running, with dark hair and determined brown eyes that seemed to see everything. She maintained perfect grades while working part-time at a local grocery store to help her mother with bills. Miguel had been laid off from the garage and was drinking more heavily, which made the house even more dangerous. The worst beating happened during Sarah's junior year. Miguel had been drinking since noon, angry about bills and his failed job search. When Sarah came home from work and found him screaming at Carlos about his grades, she made the same choice she had been making for years. She stepped between them, but this time was different. Miguel was drunker and angrier than she had ever seen him. The first blow knocked her to the ground. The second cracked her ribs. By the time Rosa came home from her shift at the diner, Sarah was unconscious on the kitchen floor, and Miguel was passed out on the couch. Rosa rushed Sarah to the emergency room, where they lied about what had happened. Sarah had fallen down the stairs, they said. The doctor, a tired-looking man named Dr. Patterson, clearly didn't believe them. But without Sarah's cooperation, there was little he could do. As he wrapped her ribs, he spoke quietly to her. Sarah, I've seen injuries like this before. If you need help, there are people who can protect you and your family. Sarah met his eyes without flinching.
I can protect my family, Doctor.
But thank you, Doctor. Patterson handed her a card for a domestic violence hotline anyway. Sarah took it, knowing she would never use it. She had learned long ago that the only person she could truly depend on was herself. The incident marked a turning point for Sarah, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of being broken by the violence, she became more determined than ever to build strength. She intensified her training, adding weightlifting to her running routine. She studied martial arts videos online and practiced the moves in secret. Most importantly, she began making plans for her future that would take her far away from the house where she had learned to be invisible. During her senior year, a military recruiter visited their school. Sergeant First Class Williams spoke to the assembly about opportunities in the Army, about serving something greater than yourself, about finding your limits and then pushing past them. As Sarah listened to him describe the challenges of basic training and the pride of earning the right to wear the uniform, she felt something she had never experienced before: hope. After the assembly, she approached Sergeant Williams with questions. He was impressed by her directness and her obvious physical fitness, but something about her intensity caught his attention. "Why the military, Miss Martinez?" he asked as they sat in the guidance counselor's office. "Because I want to be strong enough to protect people," Sarah replied, "and I want to prove that some things can't be broken." Sergeant Williams studied her for a moment. "The military will test you in ways you can't imagine. It's not just about physical strength. They'll try to break you down completely before they build you back up." Sarah's smile was small but genuine. "Sergeant, I've been tested my entire life. I'm still here." That night, Sarah went home and began filling out her enlistment papers. She didn't tell her parents immediately, knowing that Miguel would try to stop her out of spite and that Rosa would worry herself sick. Instead, she waited until everything was finalized before sitting down with her mother while Miguel was at a bar. "I'm leaving for basic training in 6 months, she told Rosa as they sat at the kitchen table. "I've enlisted in the Army." Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but she reached across the table to take her daughter's hands. "Are you sure this is what you want, Mija?"
It's what I need, Mama.
"I need to become someone who can't be hurt anymore, someone who can protect other people the way I couldn't protect us." Rosa squeezed her hands tighter. "You did protect us, Sarah. Every day you protected us." "I know. But now I want to learn to do more than just survive. I want to learn to win." When Miguel found out about her enlistment, his reaction was predictably violent. He screamed about ungrateful children and threatened to prevent her from leaving. But Sarah was 18 now, and the papers were signed. For the first time in her life, she stood up to him completely. "You can't stop me," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm not a little girl anymore, and I'm not afraid of you." Miguel raised his hand to strike her, but something in Sarah's eyes made him hesitate. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She simply looked at him with the kind of strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "But understand that if you hit me now, I will hit you back. And I've been getting stronger while you've been getting weaker." For the first time in her life, Miguel backed down. The night before she left for basic training, Sarah sat on her bed packing her few belongings. Rosa came in with a small wrapped package. "This was my grandmother's," she said, handing Sarah a simple silver chain with a small cross. She wore it when she crossed the border to give us a better life. I wore it when I married your father, thinking it would bring me luck." Rosa paused, her voice catching slightly. "Maybe it will work better for you." Sarah fastened the chain around her neck. "I'll wear it with pride, Mama." As the bus pulled away from the station the next morning, Sarah pressed her face to the window and watched her hometown disappear behind her. She thought about all the years she had spent learning to be invisible, all the pain she had absorbed to protect the people she loved, all the strength she had built in the shadows of a house filled with fear. She was done being invisible. She was done being afraid. Most importantly, she was done limiting herself to just surviving. The girl who had learned to disappear was about to become a woman who refused to be overlooked. The military had no idea what was coming, but Sarah knew exactly who she was about to become. She was about to become unbreakable. The yellow footprints at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island looked like any other painted marks on concrete, but they represented the beginning of Sarah's transformation from survivor to warrior. She had switched from Army to Marines after meeting a female Marine recruiter who told her about the Corps' reputation for producing the world's finest fighters. "We don't just train soldiers," the recruiter had said. "We forge Marines." Stepping off the bus at 3 a.m, Sarah felt the humid South Carolina air hit her face as drill instructors began screaming at the new recruits. Around her, young men and women fumbled with their belongings, some already looking overwhelmed by the chaos. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, watching and listening. This was familiar territory. She had lived with someone who used fear as a weapon her entire life. "Martinez!" Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Brooks bellowed, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot against her skin as he searched for any sign of weakness. "What are you looking at, recruit?" "Nothing, sir," Sarah responded, her voice strong and clear. "Nothing? You think you're looking at nothing? I'm looking at a weak little girl who thinks she can play with the big boys. What do you think about that, Martinez?" Sarah met his stare without flinching. "I think you haven't seen what I can do yet, sir." Staff Sergeant Brooks paused for a fraction of a second, surprised by her composure. Most recruits were trembling by this point. This one looked like she was ready for whatever came next. He made a mental note to watch this one closely. The first weeks of boot camp were designed to strip away everything recruits thought they knew about themselves. Sleep deprivation, constant stress, physical exhaustion, and mental pressure were used to break down civilian mindsets and rebuild military ones. For most of Sarah's fellow recruits, this was the hardest thing they had ever experienced. For Sarah, it was Tuesday. She excelled in every aspect of training. Her years of running had given her exceptional cardiovascular endurance, and her secret strength training showed in her performance on the obstacle courses. When other recruits struggled with the physical demands, Sarah was already helping them improve. When drill instructors tried to break her spirit with verbal abuse, she absorbed it like a stone absorbs rain. But it was during the crucible, the final 54-hour test that every Marine must pass, that Sarah truly distinguished herself. The crucible combined sleep deprivation, food deprivation, and constant movement with team-building exercises designed to forge unbreakable bonds between Marines. It was meant to push recruits to their absolute limit and beyond. Sarah's squad was struggling. 3 days into the exercise, they had been awake for nearly 48 hours, surviving on minimal rations and pushing their bodies through increasingly difficult challenges. Several squad members were beginning to break down mentally and physically. Recruit Jackson, a young man from Iowa who had been one of the strongest performers early in training, collapsed during the night march. "I can't do it anymore," Jackson gasped, his face pale and covered in sweat. "I'm done. I want to go home." The drill instructor, observing their squad, said nothing, simply watching to see how the group would respond. This was part of the test. How would they handle a teammate who was ready to quit? Sarah knelt beside Jackson, her voice calm and steady despite her own exhaustion. "Listen to me, Jackson. I know you're hurting. I know you think you can't take another step. But you can. Do you know how I know that?" Jackson shook his head weakly. "Because 3 hours ago, you carried William's pack for 2 miles when he was struggling. Because yesterday you gave half your ration to Torres when she was feeling sick. Because you've already proven you're stronger than you think you are. The only question is whether you want to finish what you started." "I don't know if I have anything left," Jackson whispered. Sarah grabbed his shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "Then use mine. I've got enough for both of us. But you have to get up. You have to take the next step and then the one after that. That's all being a Marine is. taking the next step when you don't think you can. Jackson stared at her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that gave him strength. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. Sarah immediately shouldered part of his pack weight and positioned herself beside him for support. "We move together," she said simply. "No one gets left behind." For the next 6 hours, Sarah essentially carried Jackson through the exercise without letting him realize it. She took on extra weight, gave him encouragement when he faltered, and used her own reserves to keep him moving forward. Other squad members, inspired by her example, began supporting each other in similar ways. By dawn, they were functioning as a true unit. Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Brooks watched this transformation with growing respect. He had seen many recruits go through the crucible, but few showed the kind of natural leadership Sarah was displaying. She wasn't the loudest or the most aggressive, but people followed her. More importantly, she made them better than they thought they could be. When the crucible finally ended, Sarah's entire squad had passed. As they received their eagle, globe, and anchor emblems in the ceremony that officially made them Marines, Staff Sergeant Brooks pulled Sarah aside. "Martinez, in 20 years of making Marines, I've seen a lot of different kinds of strength. Physical strength, mental toughness, stubborn determination. But what you showed out there was something different. You showed leadership under pressure. You showed the ability to make other people stronger. That's rare." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, but Brooks wasn't finished. "I'm recommending you for advanced infantry training. After that, if you're interested, there are other opportunities. Special Operations Forces are always looking for Marines who can perform under pressure. You interested in pushing yourself even further?" Sarah thought about the girl who used to hide in closets, afraid of her own shadow. She thought about all the years she had spent just trying to survive. Then she thought about Jackson and Williams and Torres, and how good it had felt to help them become stronger than they believed they could be. "Yes, sir. I want to see how far I can go." The advanced training that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Infantry school taught her advanced combat techniques, weapon systems, and small unit tactics. She learned to operate in hostile environments, to think strategically under pressure, and to lead Marines in combat situations. But more than that, she learned that her experiences growing up had given her advantages she was just beginning to understand. Where other Marines struggled with stress and uncertainty, Sarah thrived. She had lived with unpredictability her entire life. Where others broke under pressure, she became calmer and more focused. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her instructors began to notice. Captain Davis, who ran the Advanced Marksmanship program, watched Sarah consistently outperform Marines with years more experience. Her shots were precise and consistent, regardless of conditions. When he asked her about her background, she simply said she had learned to focus under difficult circumstances. "How difficult?" Captain Davis pressed. "Difficult enough that nothing you can throw at me here is going to shake me, sir." It was during this time that Sarah first heard about Force Reconnaissance, the Marine Corps' elite special operations unit. Force Recon Marines were the tip of the spear, operating deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and conducting precision strikes. The training was notoriously brutal, with failure rates approaching 80%. Only the most exceptional Marines were even invited to try. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, the grizzled veteran who served as the Force Recon recruiter, came to speak to Sarah's class about opportunities in special operations. He was a compact man with weathered features and eyes that seemed to see everything. As he described the demands of Force Recon training, Sarah felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt since deciding to join the Marines. "Force Reconnaissance isn't for everyone," Sergeant Major Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "We don't just want the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. We want Marines who can function when everything goes wrong. When the mission falls apart, when your teammates are wounded, when you're alone in hostile territory with no backup coming. We want people who get stronger under pressure, not weaker." After the presentation, Sarah approached him directly. "Sergeant Major, I'd like to volunteer for Force Recon training." Rodriguez looked her up and down, taking in her modest size and serious expression. "You understand the failure rate, Marine?"
Yes, sir.
"I also understand that failure isn't an option for me."
Why not?
Sarah thought for a moment about how to explain 16 years of survival, about learning to be strong when strength was the only thing between her family and disaster. "Because I've never had the luxury of giving up, sir, and I don't plan to start now." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment. He had learned to recognize something in the eyes of Marines who had what it took to succeed in special operations. It wasn't arrogance or bravado. It was a quiet certainty that came from having been tested in ways that went beyond physical challenges. I'll put your name on the list, Martinez. But understand this, wanting it isn't enough. Being tough isn't enough. You'll need to be better than Marines who have been training for this their entire careers. I understand, sir. When do I start? 6 months later, Sarah found herself standing outside the Force Reconnaissance Training Facility at Camp Pendleton, California. The building looked ordinary enough, but she knew that behind those walls, some of the most elite warriors in the world were forged. The training would last 6 months and would test every aspect of her physical, mental, and emotional strength. As she walked through the entrance, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the scared little girl hiding in closets to the Marine about to attempt one of the most challenging courses in the military. She thought about her mother, who had called the night before to wish her luck, and about Carlos, who was now thriving in college thanks to the discipline and protection Sarah had provided during their childhood. Most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to herself years ago, that she would become someone who couldn't be broken, someone who could protect others the way she had learned to protect her family. The instructor who greeted the new class was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, a legendary Force Recon Marine with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for producing the finest special operations warriors in the Corps. As he looked over the assembled candidates, his eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "You are here because someone thinks you have what it takes to become Force Reconnaissance Marines. Over the next 6 months, we will discover whether that assessment was correct. Some of you will quit, some of you will be injured. Some of you will fail despite your best efforts. That's not a threat, it's a statistical fact." He began walking among the candidates, studying each one. When he stopped in front of Sarah, she met his gaze steadily. "The Marines who succeed here share certain characteristics," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes continued. "They are physically capable, mentally tough, and emotionally stable. But most importantly, they understand that real strength isn't about what you can do when things are going well. It's about what you can do when everything falls apart." Sarah felt a familiar surge of confidence. She had been preparing for this test her entire life, though she hadn't known it at the time. Every beating she had endured, every moment of fear she had overcome, every time she had chosen to protect someone else despite the cost to herself, all of it had been preparation for this moment. "Training begins at 0400 tomorrow," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes announced. "Tonight, get some rest. It's the last easy night you'll have for a very long time." As the group dispersed, Sarah made her way to her assigned quarters. She had a feeling that the hardest part of her journey was just beginning. But she also knew something her instructors were about to discover. She had been broken before, and she had put herself back together stronger than ever. They thought they could break her again. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Force reconnaissance training was designed to find the breaking point of every candidate and then push them past it. Week after week, Sarah watched strong Marines quit, get injured, or simply fail to meet the impossible standards. By the halfway point, more than half of her original class was gone, but Sarah was not only surviving, she was excelling. The physical challenges were brutal, but manageable for someone who had spent years building strength in secret. 20-mile marches with full gear, endless hours of calisthenics, and combat swimming that left even Olympic-level athletes gasping for air. Sarah's body adapted and grew stronger. Her mind, sharpened by years of hypervigilance and strategic thinking under pressure, remained focused and clear. But it was the psychological warfare that separated the good Marines from the exceptional ones. And this was where Sarah's childhood truly prepared her for what others couldn't handle. Instructor Gunnery Sergeant Morrison was a master of psychological pressure. A veteran of multiple combat deployments with Force Recon, he had an uncanny ability to find each candidate's weak spot and exploit it mercilessly. He was relentless in his pursuit of mental toughness, believing that a Marine who could be broken by words would be useless in actual combat. "Martinez!" he screamed during week 8 of training, as the remaining candidates struggled through an exhausting night navigation exercise. "You think you're special because you made it this far? You think being a woman makes you some kind of inspiration story?" Sarah continued plotting her route on the map, her hands steady despite 18 hours of continuous training. "No, Gunny. I think making it this far makes me a Force Recon candidate, same as everyone else." "Wrong answer, candidate." Morrison got closer, his face inches from hers. "You're here because someone felt sorry for you, because the Corps needs to fill quotas. You're not here because you belong here." Around her, other candidates glanced over nervously. This kind of psychological assault had broken stronger Marines than Sarah. They waited to see how she would respond. Sarah looked up from her map, meeting Morrison's stare with calm brown eyes. "Gunny, with respect. If feeling sorry for people was how Marines got selected for Force Recon, this would be a much larger class. Morrison studied her for a long moment, searching for any sign that his words were having an effect. Sarah's expression remained neutral, focused, unshakable. He had been pushing candidates to their psychological limits for 15 years, and this one showed no signs of breaking. "You think you're tough, Martinez?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I think I'm here, Gunny, same as you." That exchange became legendary among the instructors. Most candidates either exploded in anger or crumbled under Morrison's pressure. Sarah had done neither. She had simply refused to be affected by it, treating his psychological attacks like bad weather, something to be endured and worked through rather than something that could stop her. But Morrison wasn't finished with her. If standard psychological pressure wouldn't work, he would have to get creative. During Week 10, the candidates were subjected to SERI training: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. This was where they learned to survive behind enemy lines and, if captured, to resist interrogation without breaking. The training was as realistic as possible, including simulated capture and interrogation by instructors playing enemy soldiers. Sarah's capture came during a night evasion exercise. She had been moving through thick forest for 6 hours, avoiding instructor patrols, when a team led by Morrison finally cornered her. The simulated violence of her capture was intense: shouting, physical restraint, and immediate disorientation techniques designed to shock and overwhelm. For most candidates, this was their first experience with being completely helpless in the hands of hostile forces. For Sarah, it was Tuesday night at home all over again. They dragged her to a mock prison facility and threw her into a small, dark cell. The walls were painted black, the space was barely large enough for a person to lie down, and harsh lights would randomly flash on and off to prevent sleep. Most candidates found this level of isolation and discomfort extremely difficult to endure. Sarah had spent years hiding in spaces not much larger than this cell. The isolation felt almost comfortable compared to the tension of waiting for her father's next violent outburst. When the lights flashed on and off, she simply closed her eyes and regulated her breathing, the way she had learned to do as a child. The interrogation began 12 hours later. Morrison, playing the role of an enemy intelligence officer, entered her cell with 2 other instructors. They had removed her uniform and given her ill-fitting prison clothes designed to make her feel vulnerable and powerless. "Well, well," Morrison said, circling her like a predator. "The tough little Marine doesn't look so tough now, does she?" Sarah sat perfectly still, her back straight, looking straight ahead. She gave him her name, rank, and service number as she had been trained to do, then fell silent. "You think staying quiet makes you strong?" Morrison leaned in close, his voice taking on a cruel edge. "You think we can't make you talk? Let me tell you something about tough girls like you. They all break eventually. Usually faster than the men, actually. All that feminism and empowerment disappears real quick when things get serious." Still nothing from Sarah. Her expression remained neutral, her breathing steady. Morrison decided to escalate. "You know what I think, Martinez? I think you're here because Daddy hurt you. I think you're trying to prove something to yourself because some man made you feel small and helpless. How am I doing so far?" For the first time, Sarah's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Morrison noticed immediately and smiled. "There it is. There's the little girl hiding inside the tough Marine. What did Daddy do to you, Martinez? Did he hit you? Did he touch you? Did he make you feel like you were nothing?" The other instructors shifted uncomfortably. Morrison was pushing boundaries even by SERI standards, but Sarah remained silent. "I bet you were such a good little victim," Morrison continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I bet you just took it until you convinced yourself that coming here would somehow make it all better. But you can't run from what you are, Martinez. You can't train away the fact that you'll always be a victim." Sarah slowly turned to look at Morrison directly. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, cutting through psychological assault like a blade through paper. "Gunny, you're absolutely right that someone hurt me. Someone made me feel small and helpless for years. Someone used fear and violence to try to break my spirit and convince me I was worthless." She paused, holding his gaze steadily. "But you know what the difference is between you and him?" Morrison leaned in, intrigued despite himself. "He was trying to destroy me. You're trying to make me stronger. And unlike him, you're actually going to succeed." The room fell silent. In 15 years of conducting SERI training, Morrison had never had a candidate respond to psychological torture by thanking him for it. He had tried to break her by attacking her past, and instead she had used that past as armor against his assault. Morrison stepped back, studying Sarah with new respect. Explain that, candidate. Every word you just said to me is designed to prepare me for actual enemy interrogation, Sarah replied. Every attempt to make me feel weak or ashamed is training for the day when real enemies try the same thing. The difference is, I've already survived the real thing. This is just practice. Morrison looked at the other instructors, seeing his own surprise reflected in their faces.
And what makes you think you can handle the real thing if it comes?
Because I've been handling the real thing my entire life, Gunny. The only difference is, now I'm strong enough to fight back. When the Siri training concluded 3 days later, Sarah had not broken. Not once. She had endured sleep deprivation, stress positions, psychological manipulation, and every other technique in the instructor playbook without giving up any information beyond her name, rank, and service number. More importantly, she had done it without losing her composure or her sense of self. Morrison pulled her aside as the candidates were released back to regular training. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I crossed lines in there that I shouldn't have crossed. Sarah considered this for a moment. No, Gunny, you don't owe me anything. You did your job. You found out whether I could be broken by psychological pressure. Now you know I can't. How? Morrison asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. 15 years I've been doing this, and I've never seen anyone handle it the way you did. What made the difference? Sarah thought about her answer carefully. I think the difference is that most people come here strong. I came here already broken and put back together. When you try to break something that's already been broken and repaired, it's usually stronger than it was originally. Morrison nodded slowly. And you're saying your childhood made you stronger? I'm saying my childhood taught me that I could survive anything. Coming here taught me that I could do more than survive. I could excel. Word of Sarah's performance during Siri training spread quickly through the instructor cadre. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had been watching her progress closely, called her to his office the next day. Martinez, I've been in Force Recon for 20 years. I've seen Marines who are physically superior to their peers, intellectually gifted, emotionally mature. But what you demonstrated during Siri training was something different. You showed the kind of unbreakable mental toughness that can't be taught. Thank you, sir. I'm not finished. That kind of toughness usually comes from one of two places: extensive combat experience or childhood trauma. You don't have combat experience yet. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. No, sir, I don't. I'm not going to ask for details about your background. That's your business. But I am going to tell you something important. Hayes leaned forward in his chair. Whatever happened to you before you came here, whatever you survived, whatever made you this strong, don't be ashamed of it. Some people are forged by comfortable circumstances. Others are forged by fire. The Marines forged by fire are usually the ones who save lives when everything goes to hell. I understand, sir. Do you? Because I've seen Marines like you before. They think they have to prove they're not victims. They think they have to be harder than everyone else to make up for their past. But that's not what makes a good Force Recon Marine. What does, sir? The ability to use everything you've learned, everything you've survived, to make the team stronger. Your job isn't to prove you're not a victim. Your job is to use the strength you built surviving victimization to protect other people from becoming victims themselves. For the first time since arriving at Force Recon training, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had been carrying the weight of her childhood like a secret shame, something to overcome rather than something that had given her unique strengths. Hayes was telling her that her past wasn't a liability to hide. It was an asset to leverage. Sir, there's something else, Sarah said. I want to volunteer for an even more challenging assignment after Force Recon training. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Force Recon isn't challenging enough for you? Force Recon is exactly what I hoped it would be, sir. But I've heard there are other opportunities for Marines who want to push themselves even further. Special operations assignments that work with other branches of the military. Hayes studied her carefully. You're talking about Joint Special Operations, Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Air Force Pararescue. Marines who get selected for those assignments are usually the top 1% of the top 1%. Yes, sir. And you think you're in that category? Sarah thought about everything she had overcome to get to this point. The frightened child hiding in closets seemed like a different person entirely. I think I won't know unless I try, sir. And I think I owe it to myself to find out how far I can go. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. There's a Navy SEAL team that occasionally accepts Marines for joint operations. They're looking for someone with your skill set, someone who can handle extreme stress, Work independently behind enemy lines and maintain operational security under any circumstances. The selection process makes force recon training look like summer camp. I'd like to volunteer, sir. Martinez, understand what you're asking for. Navy SEAL training has the highest failure rate of any special operations program in the world. The physical demands alone eliminate 90% of candidates. The psychological pressure makes what you experienced here look like kindergarten. Sarah smiled slightly. Sir, with respect, people keep telling me how hard things are going to be. So far, the hardest thing I've done in my life was surviving my childhood. Everything else has just been training. Hayes looked at her for a long moment, then reached for his phone. I'm going to make some calls. If they're interested, you'll hear from them within a week. But, Martinez? Yes, sir. Make sure this is what you want, not just what you think you should want. There's a difference between being strong enough to endure something and being called to do something. Figure out which one this is before you commit. As Sarah left Hayes' office, she thought about his words. Was she pursuing the hardest possible path because she felt called to it, or because she was trying to prove something to herself? She realized the answer was both. She felt called to push her limits because pushing her limits was how she had discovered her strength in the first place. The phone call came 3 days later. A voice that sounded like it had been carved from granite told her to report to Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, for evaluation. If she passed the initial assessment, she would be invited to attempt basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. As Sarah packed her gear for the trip to California, she reflected on how far she had come. From a scared little girl in Texas to a Force Reconnaissance Marine being considered for the most elite special operations unit in the world. But she also knew that the biggest test was still ahead of her. She was about to find out if the woman who had been forged by fire was strong enough to walk through an even hotter flame. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, callsign Reaper, had been a Navy SEAL for 12 years and had seen every type of warrior the military produced. He had trained with Army Rangers who could march for days without stopping, Marine Force recon operators who treated impossible missions like routine exercises, and Air Force pararescuemen who jumped into hurricanes to save lives. He thought he had seen every variation of courage and determination the human spirit could produce. Then he met Sarah Martinez and realized he had been wrong. The initial meeting took place in a sterile conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. Jake was there to evaluate potential candidates for a joint special operations unit that was being formed to handle the most sensitive and dangerous missions. The unit would operate in small teams, often alone behind enemy lines, with no backup and no margin for error. They needed people who were not just physically and mentally tough, but who possessed the kind of unshakable inner strength that could function independently under any circumstances. Sarah entered the room in her dress blue Marine uniform, her bearing confident but respectful. She was smaller than Jake had expected, maybe 5'6", but there was something in the way she moved that suggested controlled power. More importantly, there was something in her eyes that he recognized immediately. Marine Martinez reporting as ordered, sir, she said, her voice clear and professional. At ease, Marine. Have a seat. Jake studied her as she settled into the chair across from him. He had reviewed her file extensively. Her performance in basic training, her exceptional record in force recon training, and the glowing recommendations from her instructors. But files only told part of the story. Tell me why you want to be a SEAL. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Sir, I want to operate at the highest level possible. I want to take on missions that matter, and work with people who won't quit when things get difficult. From what I understand, that describes the teams. That's a good answer, but it's not the whole answer, is it? Jake leaned back in his chair. I've read your file, Martinez. Your performance has been exceptional, but there's something else. Something that makes you different from every other high-performing candidate who walks through that door. What is it? For a moment, Sarah was quiet. Jake could see her weighing how much to reveal, how much of her real story to share with this stranger who would decide her future. Sir, I've learned that I perform better under pressure than in comfortable circumstances. I function better when things are difficult than when they're easy. And I've learned that I can endure more than most people think is possible. How did you learn that? Sarah met his gaze directly. Through experience, sir. Jake nodded slowly. He had seen that look before, in the mirror and in the eyes of other operators who had been forged by circumstances beyond their control. What kind of experience, Marine? The kind that taught me that I could survive anything, sir. And more importantly, that I could protect other people while I was surviving it. There was something in the way she said it that made Jake pause. The words were simple, that they carried weight that spoke of hard-won knowledge. He made a decision to push deeper.
Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question and I want a direct answer. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you might die?
Yes, sir.
More than once?
Yes, sir.
And in those situations, what did you do?
Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Jake could see her accessing memories that she usually kept locked away.
When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone of something harder than steel. I figured out how to survive, sir. And I figured out how to make sure the people I cared about survived too. Jake felt something click into place. This wasn't just another tough candidate who had excelled in training. This was someone who had developed real survival instincts under actual life or death pressure. That was rare, and it was exactly what his unit needed. Tell me about leadership, Martinez. What makes a good leader? Someone who makes the people around them stronger than they thought they could be, Sarah replied without hesitation. Someone who can stay calm when everyone else is panicking, and who can make hard decisions when there are no good options. And what makes someone able to do those things? Sarah smiled slightly. Practice, sir. Lots of practice in situations where failure isn't an option. Jake stood up and walked to the window overlooking the training compound where SEAL candidates were going through Hell Week. Even from a distance, he could see the exhaustion and determination on their faces as they carried boats over their heads and performed endless calisthenics in the sand. Martinez, what you're looking at out there is some of the hardest military training in the world. The failure rate for SEAL training is over 80%. The candidates who make it through are usually extraordinary athletes with perfect physical conditioning and unshakable mental toughness. What makes you think you can succeed where so many others fail? Sarah joined him at the window, watching the candidates struggle through their training. Sir, I'm not stronger, or faster, or smarter than those candidates, but I have one advantage they don't. What's that? I've already been broken, sir. Completely broken. And I've learned that being broken doesn't mean you're finished. It means you have the opportunity to rebuild yourself stronger than you were before. Jake turned to study her profile as she continued watching the training. Explain that. Most of those candidates are afraid of being broken by the training. They're fighting to avoid experiencing something they've never experienced before. I'm not afraid of being broken because I already know I can survive it. The question isn't whether I can endure the pain or the exhaustion or the psychological pressure. The question is whether I can use those things to become better than I was when I started. Jake had conducted hundreds of these interviews over the years, but he had never heard anyone frame the challenge of SEAL training in those terms. Most candidates talked about their physical fitness, their competitive drive, their desire to serve their country. This one was talking about trauma and recovery as if they were tactical advantages. Martinez, I'm going to share something with you that's not in any manual or training curriculum. The operators who succeed in special operations, who last for years and complete the hardest missions, usually have one thing in common. They've all survived something outside of military training that taught them they could endure more than normal people think is possible. Combat, childhood trauma, life-threatening injuries, extreme poverty, something that forced them to dig deeper than they knew they could dig. Sarah nodded. And you're wondering whether I have that kind of experience? I'm not wondering. I can see it in your eyes. The question is whether you can channel it into operational effectiveness. Sir, with respect, I've been channeling it into operational effectiveness my entire life. The only difference now is that I have the training and support to do it at a higher level. Jake made his decision. All right, Martinez. I'm recommending you for SEAL training. But understand this. What you've survived in civilian life, whatever it was, doesn't guarantee success in the teams. This is a different kind of challenge. I understand, sir. But I also understand that challenges are just opportunities to discover how strong you really are. 6 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing on the beach at Coronado with 180 other SEAL candidates, listening to the instructors explain what was about to happen to them. The statistics were sobering. Fewer than 20 of them would graduate. The rest would quit, be injured, or simply fail to meet the standards. But Sarah wasn't thinking about statistics. She was thinking about a scared little girl hiding in a closet and how far that little girl had traveled to get to this beach. She was thinking about the promise she had made to herself years ago and how close she was to fulfilling it. The first phase of SEAL training was designed to weed out candidates who lacked the physical capacity for special operations. 8 weeks of running, swimming, calisthenics, and obstacle courses that pushed human endurance to its limits. Most candidates who quit did so during this phase, unable to handle the constant physical punishment. Sarah excelled immediately. Her years of running gave her a significant advantage in the endless conditioning runs, and her force recon training had prepared her for the calisthenics and obstacle courses. But more than that, she understood something that many candidates missed. The physical training wasn't really about building strength. It was about learning to function when your body was screaming at you to quit. By the end of the first week, Sarah was consistently ranking in the top 5 candidates in every evolution. By the end of the second week, other candidates were starting to notice. "Hey, Martinez," called out Rodriguez, a former Army Ranger who had been one of the strongest candidates at the beginning of training. "How the hell are you making this look easy?" Sarah looked up from where she was cleaning her rifle after a long day of training.
It's not easy, Rodriguez.
"I just don't expect it to be easy. What's the difference? When you expect something to be easy and it turns out to be hard, you feel defeated. When you expect something to be hard and it turns out to be hard, you feel prepared." Rodriguez thought about this for a moment. "So you just assume everything is going to suck? I assume that everything worthwhile is going to test me in ways I didn't expect, and I prepare myself mentally to be okay with that." It was during the 4th week of training that Sarah first encountered Instructor Chief Petty Officer Williams, the man who would become her greatest advocate and her most challenging opponent. Williams was a legend in the SEAL community, a 20-year veteran who had served on more combat deployments than any other active-duty SEAL. He was known for his ability to identify which candidates had the mental toughness to succeed in actual operations, and for his willingness to push those candidates harder than they thought they could be pushed. Williams had been watching Sarah since the first day of training, intrigued by her consistency and her apparent immunity to the psychological pressure that broke other candidates. During a particularly brutal beach workout, he decided to test her directly. "Martinez!" he screamed, his face inches from hers as she performed push-ups in the sand. "You think you're special? You think being the only woman in this class makes you some kind of inspiration?" Sarah continued her push-ups, her form perfect despite exhaustion.
Negative, instructor.
"I think making it through today makes me the same as everyone else who makes it through today." Wrong answer. You're here because the Navy wants to prove a point about women in combat. When you quit, not if, when, you're going to make it harder for every woman who comes after you. Around her, other candidates glanced over nervously. This was the kind of psychological attack that had broken strong candidates before. Williams was a master at finding weak points and exploiting them ruthlessly. Sarah finished her set of push-ups and moved immediately into the next exercise, her breathing controlled and her focus unwavering. "Instructor Williams, with respect, when I graduate from this program, I'm going to make it easier for everyone who comes after me, regardless of gender." Williams paused, surprised by her certainty. Most candidates would have said, "if I graduate," not "when I graduate."
You think graduation is guaranteed, Martinez?
"No, instructor. I think quitting isn't an option for me, which means graduation is the only possible outcome." "And what makes quitting not an option?" Sarah looked directly at Williams, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that made him understand why she was different from every other candidate he had trained. "Because I've survived worse things than this, instructor. And those things taught me that the only real failure is giving up." Williams studied her for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "We'll see, Martinez. We'll see." That night, Williams found himself thinking about Sarah's response. In 20 years of training SEALs, he had learned to recognize the difference between candidates who talked tough and candidates who actually were tough. Sarah Martinez wasn't talking tough. She was simply stating facts about herself that she had discovered through experience. The next morning, Williams pulled her aside before training began. "Martinez, I want you to understand something. Yesterday wasn't personal. I was testing you. I know, instructor, and I hope I passed the test. You did. But that was just the first test. The real tests are coming, and they're going to be harder than anything you've faced so far. Are you ready for that?" Sarah thought about everything she had overcome to get to this point. The childhood trauma, the Marine Corps training, the Force Recon selection, and now SEAL training. Each step had been harder than the last, but each step had also proven that she was capable of more than she had previously imagined. "Instructor Williams, I've been ready for this my entire life. I just didn't know it until now." Williams nodded. "Good. Because starting tomorrow, we're going to find out just how ready you really are." Hell Week arrived like a hurricane. 5.5 days of continuous training with a total of 4 hours of sleep. No breaks, no mercy, no option to quit without ringing the brass bell that sat in the center of the compound like a monument to surrender. By the time it was over, fewer than 40 candidates would remain from the original class of 180. Sarah had been preparing for Hell Week not just since the beginning of SEAL training, but since the day she first learned to endure her father's violence. Every moment of pain she had survived, every time she had chosen to protect someone else despite the cost to herself, Every hour she had spent building strength in secret, all of it had been preparation for this week. The first day began at midnight with instructors waking the candidates by throwing trash cans through the windows of their barracks, flooding the rooms with hoses, and screaming orders through megaphones. Within minutes, the candidates were outside in their underwear, shivering in the cold Pacific air, while instructors circled them like sharks. "Welcome to Hell Week," Chief Williams shouted over the chaos. "For the next 5 days, you will be cold, wet, sandy, and miserable. You will question every decision that brought you to this point. Most of you will quit before Wednesday. The question is not whether you can endure this training. The question is whether you want to badly enough to endure it." The physical challenges came in waves. Log PT, where teams of 6 candidates carried 150-pound logs over their heads while performing calisthenics. Surf torture, where candidates sat linked arm in arm in the freezing ocean while waves crashed over them for hours. Boat races, where teams carried inflatable boats on their heads while running through soft sand. Each evolution was designed to push human endurance past its breaking point. But Sarah had learned long ago that the body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. While other candidates began to break down mentally, focusing on their discomfort and exhaustion, Sarah treated the physical punishment like weather, something to be acknowledged but not something that could stop her from completing her mission. During the first night, as candidates struggled through endless hours of boat races and surf torture, several strong contenders began to show signs of cracking. Martinez, the former college football player who had seemed unbreakable during first phase, collapsed during a log PT evolution and couldn't get back up. Thompson, a former Army Ranger with 2 combat deployments, sat down in the sand during a boat race and simply stared at the ocean. "I can't do this anymore," Thompson said to no one in particular. "I just can't." Sarah was carrying the bow of her team's boat when she heard him. Without hesitation, she dropped her position and moved to where Thompson sat. "Thompson, look at me," she said. Her voice calm despite her own exhaustion. "You can do this. I know you can because you've already done harder things than this." Thompson looked up at her with glazed eyes. "No, I haven't. Nothing has ever been this hard. You survived 2 deployments in Afghanistan. You led Marines through firefights and IED attacks. You've already proven you can handle pressure that would break most people. This is different. This isn't combat. This is just torture." Sarah knelt in the sand beside him, ignoring the instructors who were watching to see what she would do. "Thompson, you're right. This isn't combat. This is training to see if you can function when everything goes wrong in actual combat. When you're exhausted and cold and hurt and scared, and people are depending on you to not quit." "I don't have anything left," Thompson whispered.
Then use mine, Sarah said simply.
"I've got enough for both of us. But you have to get up. You have to take the next step. That's all this is. Taking the next step when you don't think you can." Thompson stared at her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him why he had wanted to be a SEAL in the first place. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. "We move together," Sarah said, taking his arm. "No one gets left behind." Instructor Williams watched this exchange from a distance, noting how Sarah had instinctively moved to help a struggling teammate despite her own exhaustion. This was exactly the kind of leadership under pressure that separated good operators from exceptional ones. By Wednesday morning, the class had shrunk from 180 candidates to fewer than 60. The bell that sat in the center of the compound had been rung dozens of times as candidates decided they had reached their limit. Each time the bell rang, the remaining candidates could hear it clearly, a constant reminder that quitting was always an option. Sarah had not even considered ringing the bell. Not once. While other candidates spent mental energy debating whether they could continue, she simply continued. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant discomfort, none of it was worse than what she had already survived. If anything, this was preferable to her childhood because she knew it had a purpose and an end date. It was during Wednesday night that Sarah faced her greatest test. The evolution was called Around the World, a boat race that would take the remaining teams around the entire Coronado Peninsula. The distance was roughly 15 miles, and teams had to carry their boats over land between water segments. It was designed to last through the night and into Thursday morning, ensuring that candidates would face the challenge while at their absolute lowest point physically and mentally. Sarah's boat team had been performing well throughout Hell Week, but by Wednesday night, they were starting to fracture. Johnson, their team leader, was developing hypothermia and having difficulty making decisions. Rodriguez was suffering from severe chafing that made every movement painful. Williams, not the instructor, but a candidate with the same last name, had twisted his ankle during an earlier evolution and was barely able to keep up. 3 miles into the race, Johnson collapsed.
I can't feel my hands, he said, his voice slurred from cold and exhaustion. I can't hold the boat anymore. The team stopped, knowing that losing Johnson meant losing the race.
Both teams had to finish with all 6 members, or they didn't finish at all. The instructors who were monitoring the race said nothing, simply watching to see how the team would respond. Sarah assessed the situation quickly. Johnson was too hypothermic to continue effectively. Rodriguez was in significant pain, and Williams could barely walk. 2 other team members, Peterson and Clark, were still functional but showing signs of severe fatigue. Listen to me, Sarah said, taking charge despite not being the designated team leader. We're going to finish this race, but we need to adapt our strategy. Martinez, I can't carry the boat anymore, Johnson said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably.
You don't have to carry the boat.
You just have to stay with us. Rodriguez, how bad is the chafing? Bad, but I can deal with it. Williams, can you navigate while we carry the boat?
Yeah, I can do that.
Sarah looked at Peterson and Clark. You 2 are our strongest remaining members. We're going to redistribute the weight so that you're carrying the heaviest load. I'll take Johnson's position and help support him. Rodriguez will take a lighter position. Williams will navigate and help where he can. We finish together, or we don't finish at all. For the next 8 hours, Sarah essentially carried 2 people through the race while maintaining her own position on the boat. She supported Johnson when he stumbled, encouraged Rodriguez when the pain became overwhelming, and helped Williams navigate when exhaustion clouded his judgment. She did all of this while carrying her own share of the boat weight and dealing with her own exhaustion. The other teams began to notice what was happening. As dawn broke over the Pacific, they could see Sarah's team working as a perfect unit, despite the obvious struggles of individual members. What should have been their weakness, having multiple compromised teammates, had somehow become their strength, because one person had refused to accept failure as an option. Instructor Williams, who had been following the race in a Zodiac boat, watched this display of leadership with growing amazement. He had seen many strong candidates over the years, but he had never seen anyone carry an entire team through an evolution the way Sarah was carrying hers. She wasn't just enduring the challenge herself, she was making it possible for everyone around her to endure it too. When Sarah's team crossed the finish line, not first, but together, the instructors were waiting for them. Johnson immediately received medical attention for his hypothermia, but he had finished the race. Rodriguez's chafing was severe but treatable. Williams' ankle was swollen but not broken. They had all made it because one person had refused to let any of them fail. Chief Williams pulled Sarah aside as the team was getting medical attention. Martinez, what you just did out there was exceptional. You essentially completed that evolution for 6 people instead of 1. Sarah, exhausted but still standing straight, met his eyes. Chief, they would have done the same for me. Maybe. But they didn't have to, because you made sure they didn't need to. That's leadership, Martinez. Real leadership. Thank you, Chief. I'm not finished. In 20 years of training SEALs, I've seen exactly 3 candidates who possess the kind of strength you demonstrated tonight. Candidates who could not only endure anything you threw at them, but who could make everyone around them stronger in the process. Sarah waited for him to continue. Those 3 candidates all became legends in the SEAL community. They led successful missions that other teams couldn't complete. They brought their teammates home alive from situations that should have been impossible to survive. They became the kind of operators that other operators wanted to serve with. And you think I could become that kind of operator, Chief? Williams looked at her for a long moment. Martinez, I think you already are that kind of operator. The question is whether the Navy is smart enough to recognize what they have. Hell Week ended Friday afternoon with a securing evolution where the surviving candidates, 37 out of the original 180, were finally allowed to rest. As Sarah lay on her bunk for the first time in 5 days, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the scared little girl who had hidden in closets and absorbed violence to protect the people she loved. She thought about the teenager who had discovered that running could be a form of strength. She thought about the young woman who had enlisted in the Marines to escape her past and had instead learned to use that past as a foundation for her future. Most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to herself years ago, that she would become someone who couldn't be broken, Someone who could protect others the way she had learned to protect her family.
As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah realized that the promise had been fulfilled, not when she proved she couldn't be broken, but when she learned to help other people become unbreakable too. The remaining phases of SEAL training would test her in other ways: diving, land warfare, combat tactics.
But Hal Week had answered the only question that really mattered. Did she have the inner strength to function at the highest levels under any circumstances? The answer was yes.
Not just for herself, but for everyone around her. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez became the first female Marine to graduate from Navy SEAL training. She received her trident, the symbol of the SEAL Brotherhood, in a ceremony attended by her mother, her brother Carlos, and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from Force Recon. Chief Williams presented her with the trident personally.
"Congratulations, Petty Officer Martinez," he said as he pinned the symbol to her uniform. "You've earned the right to call yourself a Navy SEAL." Sarah looked out at the faces of her teammates, instructors, and family members.
"Thank you, Chief. But I want you to know something." "What's that?" "The title doesn't make me different than I was before. It just gives me the opportunity to use what I've always been in service to something bigger than myself."
Williams smiled. "And what have you always been, Martinez?" Sarah thought about everything she had survived, everything she had learned, and everything she had become.
The answer came to her easily, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Unbreakable, Chief. I've always been unbreakable. They just taught me how to use it."
As the ceremony concluded and Sarah received congratulations from her new teammates, she caught sight of her reflection in a window. For a moment, she saw both versions of herself: the scared child she had been and the warrior she had become.
They were the same person, she realized. The strength had always been there. She had just needed to learn how to access it. The girl who had been taught that she was nothing had become a woman who could endure anything. The victim had become the protector. The broken had become unbreakable. And this was just the beginning.